This man has actually been through more things. Just imagine that you were doing what you loved, and what happens is then all the world started to criticize you. Could any of you guys handle that? This has been the man's life for the last decade, okay? Dr. Andrew Wakefield, for example, has done more for children, more for people, I think, than any doctor. And I get to travel all over the world and speak, and I think this guy has done more for people in history. He is now, the cool thing is an award-winning film director, producer. He's committed to exposing and getting rid of the myths of the greatest medical crimes in history. Yeah, it's quite amazing. So it's always been a dream of mine to actually become a friend of his. It's always been a dream of mine to have the opportunity to have supper with this man. It's been one of my biggest pleasures to get to know this guy, because if you ever saw what they said about him nationally, and then you sit and talk to this guy is a lot nicer than I ever am. Trust me, he's a good man. So please, stand to your feet, scream as loud as you can for one of the greatest men in history of our children, is Dr. Andrew Wakefield.
Thank you very much. Patrick, thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you so much to the organizers. Patrick told me when I was on the way here this morning that there were going to be a number of pickets, protesters outside this event to protest my presence here. And God bless them, I'm delighted. One of the reasons I came to this great country is for that very reason. So I would encourage them and I would thank them. And did they turn up? Maybe not. They tend not to. They tend to confine their assault to the internet, but nonetheless, they're most welcome. Here we see the Centers for Disease Control's data on the prevalence of autism over time. And beyond the end of the 1980s, there was an explosion in this condition, such that the latest numbers, actually not even on this graph, which came out just 2 days ago, 1 in 48 children. So this trend is continuing. And there is no sign whatsoever that it will abate. What does this mean? What this means is that if you log this exponential growth, okay, can you move it on, please, because this is not working. And this is a graph from Stephanie Seneff, who is a professor at MIT. If you log this, and you can then predict, looking into the future, in 2032, 1 in 2 children will have an autism spectrum disorder. 80% of boys, 1 in 2 children. The risk for autism for a child born today is 1 in 25 at least. This is not a genetic disorder. This is an environmental disorder. I would go one step further. This is a man-made disorder. No economy, no country, no system can sustain this level of damage. If you want to look at the greatest threat to this country today, this is it. And medicine gives you the sharp end first, the worst clinical cases. They are the most manifestly obvious. What happens if you merely shave 5 points off a child's IQ? How long will that take you to detect? And this is the situation that was encountered by Needleman with lead poisoning. It took him 20 years to persuade people that the effect, the neurodevelopmental effect of lead poisoning, was to take a few points off children's IQs. And at a population level, the impact of that is absolutely enormous. And when you reach this position, what you have is no standing army, no police force, nothing. You either have autism or you look after someone with autism. Society ceases to exist as we know it. That is the future. And unless something happens dramatically, this is what we face. I became involved in this with a simple paper, a case series that was published in 1998 in The Lancet. It was a case report, nothing more. What that means is you take a collection of individual children who have a set of signs and symptoms that are so unique, so idiosyncratic that they merit publication in their own right. You can draw no conclusions, test no hypotheses. You merely report. This is what we were told. This is what we found on clinical examination investigation. And this is the way forward that we're going to take. These are the hypotheses that we propose to test in the future. This is the way in which human disease syndromes are described, whether it's AIDS or multiple sclerosis or Asperger's or Crohn's disease. A handful of patients who present with a pattern of signs and symptoms that are compelling and merit publication in their own right. This was no different, no different. And the concluding paragraph of the paper said that this study does not prove an association, not even a causal association, not prove an association between MMR vaccine and the syndrome described. More work is needed to resolve this issue. That was the conclusion of the paper. And this paper has been misrepresented more than any other paper in history. It has been put forward as a claim that MMR vaccine causes autism. I wonder how many people have actually read it. Next slide, please. This is Professor John Walker-Smith, and I want to deal with this experience very briefly just to get it out of the way. And this is the world's leading pediatric gastroenterologist. He led the clinical team that published that paper. This man was the founding father of the subject of pediatric gastroenterology. He and I and a colleague were brought before the General Medical Council, that is our regulatory body in the UK, our licensing body, and our licenses were taken away. This man has an absolutely unimpeachable career. His book teaches pediatric gastroenterologists to this day, even though he is retired. And he's lost his license for experimenting on children, for investigating children by, for example, colonoscopy without there being any clinical indication. And that was according to Brian Deer, a journalist working for Rupert Murdoch. Brian Deer has no training in medicine, no training in science, but it was his opinion that this was unethical, not indicated, and it was his opinion pitted against that of this man. And the medical profession and the media and physicians and scientists chose to believe the word of Brian Deer. And his license was taken away, as was mine. Next slide, please. And for the first time ever, it came before a proper judiciary in the form of the English High Court in Professor Walker-Smith's appeal. I appealed as well, but it would have cost me £500,000, £500,000 to pursue that, and I was at that stage pretty much bankrupt, so that could not happen. Next slide, please. This is what the judge said the first time it ever came before a proper judiciary, and this is what they said about the General Medical Council's handling of the case. There were fundamental errors, distortion of evidence, inadequate analysis, inadequate and superficial reasoning and explanation, inappropriate rejection of evidence, flawed and wrong reasoning, and numerous and significant inadequacies. Next slide, please. Universal inadequacies and some errors on the panel's determination accordingly go to the heart of the case. They are not curable. Next slide, please. The panel's, that's worked out, determination cannot stand. I therefore quash it. Next slide, please. So, the whole case was thrown out. The whole case put forward by Brian Deer was made a mockery of when it came before a proper judiciary. The General Medical Council had been told by the British government, this is the decision you are going to come to. And that's the decision they came to. The fix was in from the very beginning. Now, has anyone ever heard about the real outcome of that case? Did it ever make it into the media? No, it did not. Why? Because the media is owned by the pharmaceutical industry. And it's as simple as that. Brian Deer on himself. Brian Deer is a classic sociopath, and I do not mean that in a pejorative way. It is a fact. This is what he writes about himself. This is in an email communication when we attempted to sue Brian Deer in Texas State Court for defamation, along with the British Medical Journal that published articles saying that I had committed scientific fraud. This is discovery. Brian Deer on himself. I freely admit to being semi-notorious for packing into single, highly readable and apparently bland sentences rats' nests of complexity and implication. This is the kind of objectivity that the British Medical Journal, a major medical journal, is looking for in its writers. This is the kind of objectivity they brought to the equation. Next slide, please. And if you think that Brian Deer acted out of altruism for parents, next slide, please. This is what he wrote about parents of autistic children on the internet. The festering nastiness, the creepy repetitiveness, the weaselly, deceitful obsessiveness all signal pathology to me, and they wonder why their children have problems with their brains. This is the man in whom the medical and scientific communities invested their trust, and they are welcome to him. Next slide, please.